So most of you know I was a city kid. I grew up in a city and we did not have a garden. We had a large air shaft where my mom kept a few potted geraniums, which the squirrels ate. But at some point, my parents bought themselves a place out in the country. And my mom, for the first time since she was a little girl, was able to have a garden. And my sister, now adult, was helping my mom with the garden while she was up there on vacation. My sister was on vacation, and she realized that she knew nothing about gardening. And she came in one day and sort of plopped down on the couch and said, okay, I think I finally figured out the way to tell the weeds from the vegetables that we planted. This is how I do it. I pull it out. And if it comes back, it was a weed. Sort of like when they used to test for witches by seeing if they would drown when they threw them in, because if they didn't drown, they were witches. We have here today before us the second of 3 agrarian parables, or as apparently I've decided to call them arables, if you look at your bulletin closely, which are to be found in chapter 18 of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew, as with last week's parable of the sower, Matthew relays the parable and then helpfully or unhelpfully provides an interpretation of it. If you look closely at the parable and the interpretation in today's readings, there is something that Matthew skips. Susan's actually looking for it. There's something that Matthew skips. I'll come back to it. It is pretty clear that this commentary was written by, this interpretation was written by Matthew, because it's filled by all sorts of catchphrases of Matthew's. Things that you don't find in the other 4 Gospels. Notably, the weeping and gnashing of teeth, Matthew likes to say that. Other expressions like the close of the age, the end of the age, and the emphasis on fire. Matthew likes to use these sorts of phrases. So we're going to refer to this as Matthew's commentary because I'm not sure that it was Jesus's. It's very Matthew-ish. Matthew's commentary sets up this as a sort of an allegory, right, where each character in the parable matches up to something, right? So the sower, the landowner, the sower is the Son of Man, the reapers are the angels, the wheat, the weeds. There's one character in the parable that Matthew does not suggest any allegorical correspondence for. Anyone?
The evil one.
It says the evil one is the devil. The slaves. He leaves them out completely. Now, if you go back to the original parable, without the slaves, without this conversation between the slaves and the owner of the field, it's really not much of a story, right? Because of course weeds grow among the wheat. They always grow among the wheat. And of course the weeds must be separated from the wheat. The only tension, the only plot development, the only conflict in the story, the only twist is the landowner's response to the slaves. The servants, they come in and they say, hey, we've spotted the weeds coming up in your field. Do you want us to go get them? Pull them out? You would think they would be deserving of praise for such eagerness and initiative. The surprise in the parable is the landowner's response. Which I would suggest is probably the point of the parable. but it's left out of Matthew's interpretation. Because who is this parable directed toward? Presumably not the weeds. There's not much they can do about being weeds in this metaphor. In fact, one of the sort of disturbing things about this parable is it implies that it's sort of deterministic, right? Wheat is wheat and weeds are weeds, and we all know when we apply those to human beings where that kind of thinking can lead us. The parable is actually directed towards the slaves. In other words, all those who would ask, shall we leave them out? The ones who don't belong here? The bad ones? Can we go get them now? It is a rebuke to all the would-be reapers of the world, to whom the landowner says, not yet, and not you. The landowner says, no, wait, and then you can go back in at harvest time. He says it's not your job. It's not your job. So how is this parable applied to the real world? It has an interesting history. In the early 4th century, the early Christian church went through a time of intense persecution. And some of the church leaders in North Africa, in an attempt to save their lives, agreed to hand over their copies of the scripture. This at a time when there weren't very many copies around. And there was a turnover in the emperorship, and a new emperor who was more lenient towards the Christians came in, and a movement arose in the church of folks who said that the clergy who had given up the scriptures should be expelled from the church. They saw them as traditores, traitors. Clergy in name only. Weeds among the wheat. St. Augustine of Hippo, who was alive at the time, actually argued for unity in the church, citing this parable. And saying it is not up to us to weed out those who we think are not true believers. In fact, he rather interestingly said, so I have a little aside here. This is sometimes called the parable of the wheat and the tares, T-A-R-E-S. In modern translation, it usually says weeds because most people don't know what tares are. But tares are an agricultural weed that looks very much like wheat. It is hard to tell the difference unless you're really good at it. It became a thing where the church leaders at this time started referring to one another as tares. You're a tare in the field of the Lord. It was a sort of weird church insult at the time. But again, so the purists were arguing that the traditores were now tares and had no place in the church. Having missed the point of the parable. So Augustine came in and said, well, you know what? You clearly are the tares, for if you were wheat, you would know that you should uproot the tares. Is it intolerance to be intolerant of the intolerant? Then there are those in the history of the church who decided to just ignore the parable and look only at Matthew's interpretation and really lean into the whole last judgment thing. Pope Gregory IX ordered the Grand Inquisitor of Marburg to begin eradicating all of the weed from the field of the Lord that the devil had sown all over Germany. Apparently having forgotten that the time is not now, and we are not the reapers. these weeds? Are they, drunkards and fornicators, just your garden variety sinners? You see how I did that? Are they serious criminals? Are they murderers? Are they people who are actually doing terrible harm to their neighbors? Are they heretics? To whom must we be tolerant and patient? Let's look at the possible reasons for this. Okay, so the landowner says do not pull up the tares. He doesn't say they're not tares. He acknowledges that there is evil in the field. But he says it's not your job to uproot them. It's not the time to uproot them. Why? Because you may pull up the wheat as collateral damage. And because you can't tell which is which anyway. There were folks in the Middle Ages who pointed out that any effort to weed out heresy through some sort of inquisition was going to cause bloodshed and eventually war, which would bring terror upon all people. You can't weed out the tares without doing damage to the wheat. It's been harder for people to lean into that second possible interpretation. We can't tell. There was a bishop in Bulgaria in the 11th century who pointed out that if Matthew himself had been weeded out while he was still a tare, while he was still a tax collector and an unbeliever, the wheat of the word which was later to sprout from him would have been altogether destroyed. Sometimes we think we're looking at a weed and we're just looking at a late bloomer. It hasn't borne fruit yet. This is a complicated problem. Pope Benedict, to bring us into recent history, actually invoked this parable in talking about the clergy abuse crisis as a justification for why the church failed to weed out the sexual predators in the ranks of the clergy. Perhaps that was pushing the metaphor a little too far. Or perhaps it was just the wrong parable for the occasion. What does this parable have to say to us about the things that are facing us, problems that are facing us in this moment today? What might it have to say about the wars in Iran and in Gaza? What might it have to say about our nation's policy of mass deportation? What might it have to say about our country's long history of racial profiling? What might it have to say to those who believe that their actions are going to bring on the end times, and it is time now to to begin the reaping. Fire and brimstone always is an uncomfortable place for us to go as a church. We're not that kind of church, and I'm not that kind of preacher. And every now and then I read things and I'm like, do I even want to share this with folks? And it's disturbing for me to think that this is in my scripture. But I think this parable is not a stumbling block, because I think this parable is meant to flip that narrative. Because you can't begin to lean into this story of gathering up the tares and throwing them in the fire and sort of rubbing your hands at the thought of that last day of judgment when all the really terrible people will finally get theirs. Because as soon as you start thinking that way, you skipped the heart of the parable. That's not your job. You don't know. We are all plants in the garden. And our job is to grow and to bear fruit side by side with all the other plants in the garden, as I believe God intended from the very beginning. I don't know about you, but I'm not all that sure if I'm wheat or tare right now. But I'm fairly sure that I'm a pretty late bloomer. I'll end with one more little story about my own gardening attempts. I don't take good care of my garden. I don't. I have a tendency to just let it. But in my backyard and in my house, sort of after we moved in, the first summer, I noticed a plant, a little viney plant that was sort of finding its way up around my raspberry bushes, and had this weird pod, this weird fruiting body that was kind of oval, three-dimensional oval, green and a little bit spiky all around the outside, hanging from a vine. Does anyone know what this is? And so I thought it was cool, it was weird, but I took a photograph of it, and I put it on, as I did, to Facebook. And I said, who knows what this is? And I very quickly got two responses from two of my friends. One of them said, oh, that is a terrible weed, it will take over everything, you should rip it out right away. And the other one said, oh, this is one of my favorite plants. So I will leave you with this thought. There is no botanical definition of a weed. It's not a evolutionary category or classification. It just means a plant that is growing where someone thinks it doesn't belong. And as soon as someone decides it belongs there,